General Theory of Ethical Pedophilia. Maximilian Kiesner. 1. Introduction to Ethical Pedophilia. The term ethical pedophilia has recently emerged among leading historians and sociologists, but it has brought its own contribution to both the historical and legal understanding of pedophilia. Emerging at the intersection of political contradictions and becoming a particular stumbling block for liberal and conservative forces, this scientific category helps to understand the limits of acceptable deviation from social norms and the recognition of one's own desires and natural needs. This book largely examines multifaceted approaches to understanding this scientific category and serves as a kind of guide to its theoretical framework. Section 1:1. Schools of Ethical Pedophilia Thought. The conceptual crystallization of ethical pedophilia as a discrete subject of academic inquiry is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Its schools of thought began to actively take shape at the beginning of the period known in modern history as the Golden Age of liberal thought. This epoch, characterized by the rapid deconstruction of traditional social categories and an intensified focus on identity politics, minority rights, and the spectrum of human sexuality, provided the necessary discursive space for such a contentious concept to emerge. Within this socio-political context, the inherent complexity and provocative nature of the term ethical pedophilia prevented the formation of a monolithic doctrine. Instead, several distinct schools of thought have naturally emerged, each attempting to resolve the fundamental tensions at the heart of the concept. The primary divergence among these schools lies in their interpretation of three essential attributes that form the conceptual core of the theory. These attributes serve as the foundational axes around which scholarly debate orbits. 1. The subject of the term. The first point of contention involves the precise definition of the moral agent, or the subject. Schools diverge on whether this subject is defined solely by the experience of a fixed, exclusive sexual orientation, pedophilia as an innate identity, or by a broader range of attractions and behaviors that may include situational or transient desires. Some frameworks posit the subject as a non-offending minor attracted person, thereby centering the ethical position in the identity itself, while others approach it as a psychological profile defined by its behavioral choices, regardless of the fixity of the attraction. 2. The definition of the subject's passion. The second axis concerns the ontological and moral status of the attraction itself, the passion. Is this desire to be understood as a pathological condition, a neutral neurological variation, or a legitimate, albeit stigmatized, form of human sexuality? Interpretations range from a medical model perspective, which views the attraction as a disorder to be managed, to a more identitarian model, which frames it as a natural, immutable aspect of the self, analogous to other sexual orientations. The ethical implications for the subject vary dramatically depending on which of these interpretations is adopted. 3. The definition of key behaviors that distinguish its ethical nature. The third and most critical attribute is the behavioral and ethical framework that justifies the modifier ethical. All schools universally proscribe any sexual act with a child, grounding this in the immutable principles of child protection and incapacity to consent. However, they diverge significantly on what constitutes ethical behavior beyond this fundamental prohibition. Key debates include the permissibility of private fantasy, the consumption of fictional or artistic depictions, the ethics of self-disclosure and community formation, and the individual's obligation regarding self-management, e.g., through therapy, celibacy, or sublimation. Section 1:2. The place and role of the category of ethical pedophilia in the social sciences. The emergence of ethical pedophilia as a proposed scientific category necessitates an examination of its epistemological position and its function within the architecture of the social sciences. It does not arrive as a discrete, isolated theory, but rather inserts itself as a critical interlocutor within established disciplines, challenging core assumptions and forcing a reevaluation of fundamental concepts. Its primary role is that of a boundary object and a theoretical provocateur, serving to illuminate the intricate relationships between desire, normativity, law, and ethics. In sociology and the study of deviance, the category functions as a limit case for theories of social deviance. It forces a confrontation with the question: what constitutes deviance when a prohibited desire is consciously and permanently decoupled from proscribed action? By introducing the ethical modifier, the framework creates a conceptual space where an individual can inhabit a deeply stigmatized social identity while simultaneously adhering to a hyper-normative ethical code, the protection of children. This creates a profound tension that challenges simplistic binary models of normal versus deviant, pushing sociological analysis toward more granular understandings of how individuals negotiate and manage stigmatized identities within social structures. In historical analysis, the term ethical pedophilia provides a potentially useful analytical lens for re-examining past figures, texts, and cultural artifacts. It offers a conceptual vocabulary to discuss historical instances of adult-child attachments or representations of such attractions in art and literature, without automatically imposing an anachronistic framework of criminality or pathology. This allows for a more nuanced historiography that can separate the phenomenological experience of attraction, as it might have been understood in a specific historical context, from its behavioral manifestations and contemporary moral judgments. The category thus becomes a tool for a more precise, less presentist analysis of the history of sexuality. In legal jurisprudence and criminology, the category creates a critical wedge between the mens rea, guilty mind of a desire, and the actus reus, guilty act of a behavior. It directly engages with foundational legal principles that typically criminalize acts, not thoughts or states of being. The existence of a conceptual framework for ethical management of pedophilic attraction raises complex questions for criminological theory concerning prevention, risk assessment, and rehabilitation. It shifts some focus from purely punitive models toward strategies that support internal ethical governance and non-offending, potentially informing public health approaches to harm prevention. The place of ethical pedophilia in the social sciences is not as a settled doctrine, but as a catalytic and problematic category. Its value lies not in providing definitive answers, but in its power to generate difficult questions, expose theoretical limitations, and force a more precise and critical dialogue across multiple disciplines about the nature of normality, the geography of ethics, and the complex interplay between human interiority and the social order. Section 1.2. Functional purpose of ethical pedophilia. Having established the internal schools of thought, Section 1.1, and the external disciplinary role, Section 1.2 of the category, it is imperative to analyze its proposed functional purposes. The general theory of ethical pedophilia posits that this category is not merely a descriptive label, but serves several constitutive functions within both individual and societal frameworks. Its purpose is operational, aiming to reconfigure existing paradigms and produce specific outcomes. The primary functional purposes can be delineated as follows. 1. The provision of an existential and ethical framework for the individual. At the microsociological level, the category's foremost function is to provide a coherent life strategy for individuals who experience exclusive or non-exclusive sexual attraction to children. In the face of overwhelming social stigma and the absence of permissible identity models, the concept of ethical pedophilia offers a structured pathway that is not defined solely by pathology or criminality. By framing the non-actuation of desire as a positive ethical commitment rather than a mere passive avoidance of crime, it transforms a state of privation into one of active moral agency. This provides a dignified framework for living a celibate or non-offending life. It offers a conceptual schema that can reduce profound internal alienation and self-loathing by separating the evaluation of the self as an ethical agent from the evaluation of the attraction as an involuntary predisposition. This can be seen as a functional analog to identity affirmation models in other minority groups, though operating under the unique constraint of mandated behavioral abstinence. 2. The creation of a sociological third space. The category functions to carve out a conceptual third space between the dominant societal narratives of the pedophile as either a monstrous criminal or a diseased patient. This space allows for the existence of a subject who is neither, but rather a moral agent navigating a profoundly challenging psychological and social reality. It provides a precise, if controversial, terminology that allows researchers to discuss non-offending populations without euphemism or conflation with offenders. Theoretically, this conceptual space can legitimize the creation of community-based or therapeutic support systems focused exclusively on reinforcing non-offending behavior, separate from systems designed for rehabilitation of offenders. 3. A diagnostic tool for social norms and legal boundaries. On a macro-societal level, the category functions as a diagnostic or stress test for the limits of social tolerance and the logic of legal systems. Its purpose is to probe and make visible the unspoken assumptions that undergird our social order. It forces a society to confront the question of whether its ethical systems have a place for an individual who embodies a universally reviled desire, but adheres to a universally mandated ethical prohibition. The societal reaction to the very concept serves as a barometer of the capacity to separate identity from action. By explicitly and rigorously condemning illegal acts, the ethical framework highlights the current legal frontier which typically governs behavior, not thought or identity. Its function is to reinforce this frontier while questioning any societal or institutional practices that seek to punish individuals for their internal state of being alone. The functional purpose of the category ethical pedophilia is multifaceted. It operates as a survival mechanism for the individual, a categorical innovation for sociology, and a critical probe for society at large. It aims to introduce a gradient of ethical evaluation into a domain governed typically by a rigid binary, thereby proposing a more complex, though undoubtedly challenging, understanding of human sexuality, moral agency, and social integration. Section 1.4. Theories of the origin of stigmatization. To fully comprehend the societal and discursive position of ethical pedophilia, one must first engage with the profound and near-universal stigmatization of pedophilia itself. The intensity of this stigma is not a historical accident, but a complex social phenomenon with deep-rooted theoretical origins. Understanding these origins is paramount, as the proposed category of ethical pedophilia exists in direct dialogue with and in opposition to this stigmatizing force. Several interconnected theories from sociology, anthropology, and psychology offer explanations for its development and potency. 1. The biosocial theory of protected childhood. This theory posits that the protection of the young is an evolutionary imperative for the survival of the species and the stability of the social unit. From this perspective, stigma functions as a powerful social immune response against behaviors that threaten the physical, psychological, and developmental well-being of children. The stigma is not merely a cultural construct, but is underpinned by a deep-seated, cross-cultural instinct to safeguard those who are vulnerable and incapable of providing full consent. Thus, any attraction perceived as predatory toward this protected class triggers an excessive moral and social rejection. 2. The sociological theory of boundary maintenance. Drawing from the work of Emil Durkheim and later Irving Goffman, this theory frames stigma as a mechanism for reinforcing social norms and collective identity. By creating a stigmatized other, the figure of the pedophile society draws a bright, unambiguous moral boundary. This boundary serves to solidify the community's shared values around childhood, innocence, and sexual normativity. The pedophile, as the ultimate deviant, becomes a symbolic foil against which the normal and virtuous community defines itself. The intensity of the stigma is thus proportional to the importance of the boundary being defended. 3. The psychoanalytic theory of projected anxiety. Psychoanalytic interpretations suggest that the extreme revulsion directed toward pedophilia may, in part, stem from unconscious defense mechanisms. In a society that has simultaneously eroticized youth and sanctified childhood, the figure of the pedophile becomes a receptacle for projected anxieties about adult sexuality, desire, and lost innocence. The pedophile is cast as the embodiment of a disavowed and uncontrolled primal urge, allowing the broader society to externalize and condemn these troubling aspects of the human psyche, thereby maintaining a self-image of sexual propriety. 4. The historical religious theory of taboo and purity. This theory traces the stigma to religious and cultural codes that have long demarcated certain sexual acts as impurities or taboos. Violations of these taboos were seen as polluting not just the individual but the entire community. While modern secular law frames the issue in terms of harm and consent, the powerful, effective residue of religious prohibition, the language of defilement, corruption, and absolute sin, continues to fuel the visceral nature of the stigma. The pedophile is thus viewed not merely as a criminal, but as a modern-day polluter, a status that attracts a unique form of moral disgust. 5. The modern legal media theory of the folk devil. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the pre-existing stigma has been amplified and codified through the interplay of media representation and legal discourse. The pedophile has been constructed as a contemporary folk devil, a ubiquitous and monstrous figure in news media, popular culture, and political rhetoric. This process, often described as a moral panic, homogenizes a diverse range of behaviors and individuals into a singular threat, justifying enhanced social control and surveillance. The stigma is thus systematically reproduced and intensified, becoming a self-perpetuating cycle where any nuanced discussion becomes socially impermissible. The stigmatization of pedophilia is overdetermined, arising from a convergence of evolutionary instincts, social functionality, psychological projection, historical taboos, and modern media dynamics. The project of introducing a category of ethical pedophilia does not seek to dismiss the valid protective functions of this stigma. Rather, it operates by attempting to surgically separate one element, the management of non-acting desire, from the monolithic complex of condemnation, arguing that the current structure of stigma may itself be an impediment to harm prevention and a more precise understanding of human sexual diversity. 2. Charlie O'Leary's Ethicoptophile School. The theoretical landscape of ethical pedophilia is notably shaped by the contributions of figures operating at the intersection of academia, public health, and the arts. Among the most influential is Charlie O'Leary, a Chicago-based playwright and librettist, whose work has culminated in a distinct and pragmatically oriented framework. While his professional background in the theater evidenced by his tenure at the Iowa Playwrights Workshop and Development with institutions like the Flea Theater and Pipeline Theater Company may seem unconventional for a social theorist, it profoundly informs his approach. His methodology is narrative and humanistic, focused on deconstructing societal scripts and recasting the protagonist in the drama of pedophilic attraction from a predetermined villain to a complex moral agent. Section 2.1. Systematic definition of pedophilia and its distinction from ephebophilia. A foundational element of Charlie O'Leary's Ethicoptophile School is the rigorous precision in terminology. The conflation of distinct concepts, such as pedophilia and ephebophilia, has profound implications for legal, clinical, and social discourses, often leading to misdirected stigma and ineffective prevention strategies. This section provides a systematic definition of pedophilia and delineates its critical differences from ephebophilia, underscoring the necessity of this distinction for a coherent theory of ethical pedophilia. Pedophilia is primarily defined within clinical, legal, and social frameworks, each contributing to a comprehensive understanding. 1. Clinical definition. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, pedophilia is classified as a paraphilic disorder characterized by recurrent, intense sexually arousing fantasies, urges, or behaviors involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children, generally aged 13 years or younger. The individual must be at least 16 years old and at least 5 years older than the child. Importantly, the DSM-5 distinguishes between pedophilic interest, which may not necessitate disorder, and pedophilic disorder, which requires significant distress or impairment or acting on these urges. This clinical nuance is vital. It separates the attraction itself from the associated harm or dysfunction, allowing for the conceptual space of ethical management. 2. Legal definition. Legally, pedophilia is often conflated with child sexual abuse, but they are not synonymous. Pedophilia refers to the attraction, while child sexual abuse denotes criminal acts. Most jurisdictions criminalize sexual contact with minors below the age of consent, which varies globally, e.g., 16 to 18 years in many U.S. states, but lower in some countries. However, the legal focus is on behavior, not attraction. This distinction is crucial for the ethical pedophilia framework, as it emphasizes that non-offending individuals, regardless of attraction, are not criminals. 3. Social definition. Socially, pedophilia is frequently misunderstood as a monolithic evil, encompassing any attraction to minors regardless of developmental stage. This oversimplification ignores clinical specifics and fuels stigma, hindering rational discourse and prevention efforts. In public discourse, the term is often used pejoratively to label any age-disparate attraction, further blurring critical distinctions. Ephebophilia, a term derived from the Greek ephebos, youth, refers to a sexual preference for mid to late adolescents, typically ages 15 to 19, who are postpubescent. This concept is less formalized in diagnostic manuals, but is recognized in sexological research to describe attractions that are distinct from pedophilia. Unlike pedophilia, which involves prepubescent children, ephebophilia centers on adolescents who have undergone puberty. Adolescents possess a degree of physical and cognitive maturation that children do not, though their capacity for consent remains a complex ethical issue. Ephebophilia is not classified as a paraphilic disorder in the DSM-5, as attraction to sexually mature adolescents may fall within normative ranges of human sexuality, depending on context and behavior. The attraction to adolescents, ephebophilia, is often culturally and legally treated with more nuance than pedophilia. For example, many societies have Romeo and Juliet laws that decriminalize consensual sexual relationships between minors and adults close in age. However, when older adults pursue adolescents, power dynamics and consent issues arise, leading to social condemnation. Despite this, ephebophilia is not equivalent to pedophilia, and conflating the two can lead to disproportionate responses, as illustrated in O'Leary's play, where Mayor Matthew Roman's attraction to a 19-year-old is falsely equated with pedophilia. Blurring the lines between pedophilia and ephebophilia perpetuates harmful myths, such as the false association between homosexuality and child abuse. In Basically Children, Aaron's campaign against Matthew Roman relies on this conflation, leveraging the stigma of pedophilia to attack legal adult relationships. O'Leary's framework argues that such conflation undermines credible child protection efforts by diverting resources from actual threats and alienating non-offending individuals who might otherwise seek help. The distinction allows for a more targeted approach to ethics. Pedophilia, involving attraction to prepubescent children, requires absolute prohibitions on action, supported by therapeutic interventions. Ephebophilia, while still ethically fraught due to power imbalances, may involve legal relationships that necessitate different ethical considerations, such as the campsite rule, leaving the younger partner better than they were found. By separating these concepts, the theory can advocate for tailored support systems that address the specific risks and needs of individuals with different attractions, ultimately enhancing child safety. A systematic definition of pedophilia and its clear distinction from ephebophilia is a cornerstone of the ethicoptophile school. It enables a nuanced understanding that prioritizes child protection while avoiding the pitfalls of stigma and misinformation. This precision is not only clinically and legally sound, but also ethically necessary for developing compassionate and effective strategies to manage potentially harmful attractions within a framework of non-offending integrity. Section 2. Definition of non-offending pedophiles and the ethical nature of their behavior. Having established a systematic definition of pedophilia and its distinction from other attractions, we can now precisely define the central figure in Charlie O'Leary's framework, the non-offending pedophile. This category is not merely descriptive, but constitutes a specific ethical position. The non-offending status is not a passive condition, but an active, ongoing practice of self-governance, forming the very basis of its ethical character. A non-offending pedophile is an individual who experiences a persistent and exclusive or predominant sexual attraction to prepubescent children, but who consciously and consistently adheres to a personal and social ethic that absolutely prohibits the actuation of this attraction. This definition can be broken down into three constitutive pillars. 1. The phenomenological pillar, the attraction. The individual acknowledges the existence of a sexual attraction to prepubescent children. This attraction is typically understood as immutable, a fixed aspect of their psychosexual orientation rather than a chosen preference. This pillar separates the non-offending pedophile from the general population on the basis of internal experience alone. 2. The behavioral pillar, the non-actuation. The individual refrains from any behavior that could cause harm to a child. This prohibition is comprehensive and includes contact offenses, any physical sexual contact with a child, non-contact offenses, the production, distribution, or consumption of child sexual abuse material, CSAM, grooming behaviors, any deliberate action aimed at facilitating sexual contact with a child by breaking down their boundaries or the trust of their guardians. 3. The ethical practical pillar, the active management. This is the defining pillar that transforms a mere absence of offending into a positive ethical stance. It involves the active pursuit of strategies to manage the attraction and maintain the behavioral prohibition. The ethical justification for labeling this behavior ethical pedophilia rests on a deontological framework that prioritizes duty and the adherence to a moral law irrespective of desire. The ethical core lies not in the desire itself, which is involuntary, but in the conscious, willful, and continual subordination of that desire to a higher moral principle, the absolute protection of children. In this framework, the non-offending pedophile is a moral agent who, confronted with a desire they did not choose, makes a continuous ethical choice to neutralize its potential for harm. This is the admirable quality that Matthew Roman identifies in O'Leary's play: the strength to deny oneself what one wants because one recognizes that fulfilling that desire is evil. The ethical nature is not conferred by a single decision, but is a perpetual project of the self. It is a commitment to a lifelong discipline of celibacy and self-vigilance. This aligns with virtue ethics, where the ethical character is built through habitual right action. The individual cultivates the virtues of restraint, integrity, and responsibility. From a consequentialist perspective, the behavior of non-offending pedophiles directly contributes to the primary prevention of harm. Every individual who successfully manages their attractions in this way is one less perpetrator of child sexual abuse. Therefore, creating a society that supports this non-offending status by reducing stigma and providing access to confidential therapeutic resources is a pragmatic and highly effective public health strategy for child protection. The ethical behavior of the individual thus aligns with the collective good. While some within advocacy circles use this term, the ethical pedophilia framework prefers non-offending to avoid connotations of moral superiority. The emphasis is on the concrete, observable behavior non-offending and its ethical structure, rather than an inherent quality of the person. Many individuals who sexually abuse children are not pedophiles. Their actions are driven by factors like power, opportunity, or poor impulse control rather than a fixed exclusive attraction. The non-offending pedophile is defined by their attraction, whereas the situational offender is defined by their actions in a given context. A non-offending pedophile has never offended. Their ethical identity is built on prevention, not rehabilitation. This is a critical distinction for both personal identity and public perception, as it underscores the possibility of living with this attraction without ever causing harm. The non-offending pedophile, as defined within O'Leary's school, represents a specific ethical subject whose identity is constituted by the rigorous management of a stigmatized and dangerous attraction. The ethical nature of their behavior is found in the active, willful, and lifelong commitment to a principle that transcends their desire, making them a crucial, if often invisible, partner in the primary prevention of child sexual abuse. Recognizing and understanding this category is the first step toward developing societal structures that support, rather than undermine, this ethical project. Section 2.3. The problem of administrative, judicial, precedent in determining minors. The theoretical clarity of the age of consent is shattered upon contact with the reality of judicial and administrative practice. The legal system does not operate on a single, consistent definition of a child, but rather employs a fluid and often contradictory logic that serves its immediate purposes. The legal framework presents a schizophrenic approach to the definition of childhood and adulthood. In the context of sexuality, the law erects a rigid, chronological wall to protect all individuals below a certain age from sexual contact with adults. Here, the minor is constructed as inherently vulnerable, incapable of consent, and in need of absolute protection. In the context of criminal justice, particularly for violent crimes, this protective frame often dissolves. Through mechanisms like judicial waiver or direct file statutes, prosecutors and judges can, and disproportionately do, decide that minors, especially Black and brown youth, should be tried as adults. In this frame, the same 17-year-old who was deemed incapable of consenting to sex is suddenly deemed fully capable of forming criminal intent and deserving of adult-level punishment. This creates the phenomenon of the adultified minor, a young person whose vulnerability is systematically ignored and whose culpability is maximized based on racial bias and the nature of the alleged act. The foundational principle of juvenile justice parens patriae, the state as parent, is selectively abandoned. For these children, the state acts not as a protective guardian, but as a punitive authority, arguing they are beyond the rehabilitative aims of the juvenile system. This demonstrates that the category of child is not a fixed biological or developmental reality, but a social and legal status that is selectively granted or revoked, often along racial lines. Studies consistently show that children of color, particularly Black boys, are perceived as older, less innocent, and more culpable than their white peers. This implicit bias translates directly into practice. They are more likely to be arrested, charged, and transferred to adult criminal court. This contradiction poses a profound challenge to any discourse, including that of ethical pedophilia, that seeks to use legal age boundaries as a definitive moral anchor. When the state itself cannot consistently define who is a child, the moral force of the age of consent law is weakened in public discourse. It becomes harder to defend the line as a sacred, universal principle when the same system that draws it routinely disregards it in other, equally consequential, contexts. The theory of ethical pedophilia is built on the axiom of the child's absolute and universal vulnerability. The judicial precedent of trying minors as adults directly contradicts this, asserting that some minors are not vulnerable, but are instead dangerous and fully responsible agents. This forces a critical question. If the state can declare a 17-year-old mature enough to face a life sentence, on what coherent ethical grounds can we declare that same 17-year-old incapable of any degree of sexual agency? This does not justify adult-minor sexual relationships, but it highlights the inconsistent logic that the theory must navigate. This problem pushes the theory beyond a simplistic reliance on legal codes. It argues that the ethical imperative to protect the young must be grounded in something more robust than a statutory age limit that the justice system itself applies selectively. The focus must shift from a rigid adherence to a chronological line to a more holistic understanding of power, development, and exploitation. The ethical pedophile's commitment is not just to avoiding illegal acts, but to preventing harm based on a consistent principle of protecting the immature, a principle that the judicial system itself violates. The administrative and judicial precedent of trying minors as adults reveals the age of consent to be a permeable and politically charged boundary, not a natural law. Therefore, the ethical injunction against offending cannot be based solely on the legality of the act. It must be rooted in a deeper, more consistent ethical principle, the recognition of a fundamental developmental asymmetry and the absolute imperative to never exploit it. The system's failure to uniformly uphold this principle for protection does not weaken the pedophile's ethical duty. Rather, it highlights the gravity of adhering to a higher standard of care and consistency than the state itself often displays. Section 2.4. The Rehabilitative Social Contract. Charlie O'Leary's framework implicitly contains a critique of modern society's approach to non-normative sexualities, particularly pedophilia. The current paradigm is purely prohibitive and punitive. It identifies individuals with a dangerous attraction and systematically severs them from community, support, and any positive social identity, using the threat of ruin as its primary tool. This approach, O'Leary's work suggests, is not only cruel but fundamentally counterproductive, creating the very conditions that increase risk. In its place, his theory advocates for a rehabilitative social contract, a societal shift from ostracization to a carefully managed integration, which includes the controversial but essential idea of allowing non-offending individuals safe, supervised proximity to children as a means of practicing and mastering self-control. As analyzed previously, the stigma is so potent that it forces individuals into absolute secrecy. This isolation is psychologically devastating, cutting them off from the very relationships and support networks necessary for mental stability. The primary societal institutions for dealing with this issue are the legal and penal systems. There is no before, there is only the after of a crime. This model offers no pathway for a person who wants to live ethically before offending, only punishment for those who fail. The system is designed not to rehabilitate, but to destroy, treating the individual as a monolithic threat rather than a complex moral agent. This approach, O'Leary argues, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. By denying a person all forms of positive identity, community, and purpose, society increases their despair, bitterness, and psychological fragility, thereby elevating the risk that they will succumb to their attractions. O'Leary's Ethicoptophile school proposes inverting this model. Instead of a society that pushes individuals toward the brink, it calls for one that actively builds guardrails and provides a path toward a meaningful, offense-free life. This rehabilitative social contract would be built on two pillars. 1. Systemic destigmatization and therapeutic access. This involves creating publicly funded, confidential support systems and therapeutic resources specifically designed for non-offending minor-attracted persons. The goal is to dismantle the isolation by providing a professional, non-judgmental space where individuals can learn coping mechanisms, manage shame, and reinforce their ethical commitment without fear of exposure or preemptive punishment. 2. The controlled practice of self-control. Proximity as rehabilitation. This is the most radical and essential tenet. The current model insists that non-offending pedophiles must simply stay away from kids, which, while a correct ultimate goal, is an oversimplification of the therapeutic process. A life of total, absolute avoidance is not only inhuman, it denies a fundamental aspect of self-mastery. True ethical discipline is not developed in a vacuum. Just as a recovering alcoholic must learn to navigate a world where alcohol is present, an ethical pedophile must learn to manage their attraction in a world populated by children. Permanent avoidance fosters a toxic dynamic of simultaneous obsession and fear, keeping the attraction at the center of the individual's psychological life. The rehabilitative social contract would allow for carefully managed, non-sexual, and supervised interactions with children in a therapeutic or community context. This could take the form of participating in community service, e.g., volunteering at a food bank under strict protocol, or in a clinical setting, engaging in controlled exposures as part of a therapeutic regimen. For the individual, it allows them to recontextualize children not as objects of forbidden desire, but as whole human beings deserving of protection. It provides a real-world arena to practice and strengthen their ethical muscles, transforming abstract restraint into lived virtue. It reduces the obsessive, forbidden fruit quality of the attraction by normalizing non-threatening contact. For society, It creates a documented record of an individual's successful management of their impulses under professional supervision. It transforms the non-offending pedophile from a hidden, feared unknown into a known quantity who is actively and transparently engaged in their own rehabilitation, thereby genuinely increasing public safety. The current system ruins lives preemptively because it cannot conceive of a pedophile who is not an offender. It operates on fear, not wisdom. Charlie O'Leary's theory demands a more courageous and sophisticated society, one that understands that the ultimate form of child protection is not the destruction of the individual who feels the attraction, but the active cultivation of their ethical capacity. By replacing a logic of ruin with a rehabilitative social contract that offers support, community, and the opportunity to practice integrated self-control, society can finally become a partner in prevention, rather than an engine of the very despair it claims to fear. Section 2(5). The institution of abortions as a voluntary mean of protection against excesses perpetrated by ethical pedophiles. Within the stark logic, a theoretical extension emerges that warrants critical examination. The potential role of voluntary abortion as a societal mechanism for mitigating the perceived risk posed by the existence of individuals with pedophilic attractions, including those committed to a non-offending ethical framework. While the theory of ethical pedophilia is predicated on the rigorous self-control of non-offending individuals, it acknowledges that no system of human management is infallible. The existence of a non-offending class does not erase the statistical reality of child sexual abuse, much of which is perpetrated by individuals not formally identified as pedophiles. From a certain utilitarian perspective, the voluntary decision to abort a pregnancy could be framed as the ultimate act of preemptive harm reduction, a guarantee that a potential victim will never be brought into a world where a risk, however small, exists. Proponents might argue that if the knowledge of a potential threat, the existence of pedophiles, ethical or otherwise, causes significant anguish or fear for a prospective parent, the autonomy to terminate a pregnancy provides a direct, personal solution to that fear. This frames abortion not as a reaction to a specific, immediate threat, but as a response to a generalized, statistically present risk, analogous to choosing not to have a child due to fears about climate change or societal collapse. The proposition of abortion as a voluntary shield against ethical pedophilia is a reaction born of the very stigma and fear that the theory of ethical pedophilia seeks to combat. It concedes that society is incapable of creating a safe environment for children and instead offers a tragic, individualistic solution that avoids the collective work required. 3. Klaus Schwab's Ethikoptophile School. Moving from the individual-focused, public health model of Charlie O'Leary, we arrive at a macro-level framework, the Ethikoptophile School of Klaus Schwab. Schwab, a notorious political economist and former chairman of the World Economic Forum, WEF, articulates a vision where the management of pedophilia is not a private or clinical matter, but a central imperative of transnational governance and economic policy. His school, often termed the Davos School, after the location of its inaugural symposium, posits that in an interconnected global society, the pedophilic question is a systemic risk that must be managed through coordinated, top-down action by states and corporations. Schwab's foundational thesis is that unmanaged pedophilic attraction represents a profound and destabilizing systemic risk to the global order, on par with climate change or cyberterrorism. He argues that the current, fragmented approach where policies vary by nation and stigma forces the issue underground creates dangerous pockets of instability. Section 3(1). The vulnerability chain in a globalized world. Klaus Schwab's Ethikoptophilic School introduces the concept of the vulnerability chain as its core diagnostic tool for understanding the inadequacy of nation-state approaches to pedophilia in the 21st century. This model argues that globalization has not eradicated the threat of child sexual abuse. Rather, it has fragmented and interlinked it across borders, creating a complex, resilient, and transnational system of risk. The chain metaphor illustrates how a failure or vulnerability in one link be it technological, jurisdictional, or socioeconomic directly, enables exploitation and undermines protective efforts across the entire system. The first and most potent link in the chain is the digital infrastructure that enables global connectivity. Schwab argues that the very architecture of the Internet, designed for open communication and commerce, creates inherent vulnerabilities for child protection. A perpetrator in one country can use an encrypted messaging app developed in a second country to contact a minor in a third. The jurisdictional fragmentation of tech regulation means no single legal regime can effectively police this ecosystem. Cloud servers hosting illegal content may be physically located in a country with lax enforcement, while the users accessing it are distributed globally. This makes takedown efforts slow and legally complex. Schwab posits that the digital realm does not just create new threats, but absorbs and amplifies analog ones. A local, non-offending individual, isolated and stigmatized in their physical community, can now find not only support online, but also, dangerously, echo chambers that normalize their attraction. The Internet becomes a crucible where an ethical struggle can tip toward delinquency through anonymous global reinforcement. The second link is the patchwork of national laws and the limitations of international cooperation. The chain is only as strong as its weakest jurisdictional link. As previously discussed, the legal definition of a child varies significantly. An individual may engage in a relationship that is criminal in their home country, but legal in the country where the minor resides, creating a legal loophole that can be exploited through travel or digital interaction. Even when a clear crime has been identified, cumbersome extradition treaties and data privacy laws, like GDPR, can hinder investigations and prosecutions. Evidence gathered in one country may be inadmissible in another, allowing perpetrators to shield themselves behind borders. Schwab also identifies certain regions as safe havens due to corruption, ineffective judiciary, or simply a lack of prioritization of child protection. These become critical nodes in the vulnerability chain, allowing for the operation of abuse networks, the hosting of illegal content, and the sheltering of offenders. The final link leverages global socioeconomic disparities. Poverty and lack of opportunity are weaponized as tools of exploitation. In economically disadvantaged regions, children and families are more vulnerable to coercion. A globalized economy facilitates the trafficking of victims across borders for exploitation, with the movement of victims often mirroring other economic flows from poorer to richer regions. Child sex tourism is the classic manifestation of this link. Predators from wealthy nations travel to countries with weaker enforcement and widespread poverty to exploit children. The entire economy of certain locales can become indirectly dependent on this illicit tourism, further complicating local enforcement. Schwab extends this to the digital realm. A child in a low-income household, with less supervised access to the Internet and potentially seeking economic opportunity online, is at a significantly higher risk of being groomed and exploited by a predator in a wealthy nation who can offer monetary incentives. The vulnerability chain demonstrates that pedophilia and child sexual abuse are no longer merely individual crimes or national problems. They are systemic global risks. An economic policy in Europe, a tech innovation in Silicon Valley, a judicial ruling in Southeast Asia, and a social services failure in South America are all interconnected links in the same chain. A break in one link, for instance, a robust age verification law in one country is futile if the other links remain intact, as the threat will simply root around it. Therefore, Schwab argues, the solution must be equally systemic. The ethical pedophilia framework, at this global level, is not merely about managing individual desires, but about fortifying the entire chain against exploitation through coordinated international policy, corporate responsibility, and a reconception of child protection as a fundamental pillar of global security. Section 3.2. The socioeconomic benefits of ethical pedophilia in the context of the pornographic industry. A controversial, yet in the view of the Davos School, economically significant aspect of the ethical pedophilia framework involves its indirect interaction with the legal adult pornography industry. Klaus Schwab's analysis does not focus on the attraction itself as a marketable commodity, an approach he would deem ethically abhorrent and practically dangerous, but on the macroeconomic stabilization and market segmentation that a successful ethical pedophilia policy could facilitate. The argument centers on the management of demand and the formalization of a shadow economy. The core economic thesis is that a portion of the demand for illegal child sexual abuse material, CSAM, stems from individuals with pedophilic attractions who lack legal, ethical outlets for their sexuality. While the ethical pedophile's primary commitment is to non-actuation, the Davos School acknowledges the pragmatic public health goal of harm reduction. The school theorizes that the regulated availability of certain legal adult pornography genres, specifically fictionalized animated or illustrated content, hentai, lolicon, that does not involve actual minors, could function as a pressure valve. For some individuals struggling with their attractions, these legal genres could serve as a substitute good, potentially reducing demand for CSAM, which is predicated on the actual abuse of children. Much of this content currently exists in a legal gray area, with significant consumption occurring on unregulated platforms. By bringing the production and distribution of such legal, fictional adult content into a formalized, regulated industry, it could be taxed, subjected to age verification controls, and its producers held to legal standards. This transforms an informal, often illicit digital economy into a source of tax revenue and a sector that can be monitored and studied. Schwab's analysts frame this not as an endorsement of the content, but as a cost-benefit analysis of its macroeconomic externalities. A key socioeconomic benefit proposed is the potential reduction in the immense law enforcement and judicial resources required to combat CSAM. If a segment of consumers is diverted to a legal alternative, the scale and intensity of the illicit market could be reduced, leading to significant public sector cost savings. This is framed as a pacification of a volatile and resource-draining criminal niche. The current illicit CSAM economy generates massive negative externalities: the lifelong trauma to victims, the healthcare costs, and the social decay. The legal, fictional alternative, while controversial, generates none of these specific, catastrophic harms. From a coldly economic perspective, the substitution represents a net reduction in social cost, even as it creates a taxable, formal industry. A proposition within the school suggests levying a special tax on the revenue generated from these specific legal genres. This revenue would be directly funneled into the public health infrastructure, supporting non-offending individuals, and funding victim support services, creating a self-reinforcing loop where the industry contributes to mitigating the broader social issue it is adjacent to. Schwab's analysis of the pornographic industry explicitly does not advocate for the normalization of pedophilic attraction, but for the strategic management of its behavioral externalities through market mechanisms. The socioeconomic benefit is not seen in the revenue of the industry itself, but in the net reduction of the colossal costs associated with the illicit CSAM economy and the resultant abuse. It is a pragmatic, albeit deeply controversial, calculation that prioritizes the reduction of tangible harm over moral absolutism, positioning the state and corporations as active managers of a complex and dangerous facet of human sexuality. Section 3.3. Early pornography introduction as a way of developing the ability to recognize unethical pedophilia. A particularly contentious proposition within Klaus Schwab's Davos School is the theory of proactive sexual literacy, which includes the controlled, pedagogical introduction of age-appropriate erotic materials to adolescents upon the onset of puberty. It is crucial to state that this theory is not about the sexualization of children, but is framed as a public health and security strategy. The core hypothesis is that, in an increasingly sexualized digital landscape, a controlled, educational exposure is a lesser evil that can build cognitive immunity against predatory behavior, thereby indirectly supporting the social framework of ethical pedophilia. Schwab's analysts argue that the current paradigm of attempting to keep children in a state of sexual ignorance is both unrealistic and counterproductive in the digital age. Prohibiting access often fuels curiosity, driving adolescents to seek information through unregulated channels, search engines, social media, and peer networks where they are highly likely to encounter distorted, violent, or predatory content without any contextual framework. The Davos School proposes a medical analogy. Just as a vaccine introduces a weakened pathogen to build immunity, a curriculum-controlled introduction to eroticism could, in theory, help adolescents build cognitive schemas for recognizing inappropriate and predatory behavior. The stated goal is to demystify sexuality in a safe context, thereby making a child less susceptible to the grooming tactics of a predator who relies on a target's confusion, shame, and ignorance. The theoretical mechanism for this recognition is based on teaching adolescents to identify violations of consent and power dynamics. The pedagogical materials would not focus on the sexual acts themselves, but on the narrative and contextual framing. Adolescents would be guided to analyze: is the interaction mutual? Is there a clear power imbalance, e.g., age, authority, knowledge? Is there coercion or manipulation? The curriculum would theoretically aim to teach children to recognize classic grooming behaviors: love bombing, secret keeping, boundary testing, and the gradual normalization of inappropriate touch, by contrasting them with models of healthy, peer-based exploration and respect for bodily autonomy. The argument is that a child who understands the concept of enthusiastic consent is a harder target for a predator. 4. Keir Starmer's Ethicopedophile School. Moving from the globalist, technocratic vision of Klaus Schwab, we encounter a school of thought that grounds the theory of ethical pedophilia in a framework of cultural tradition and communitarian ethics. Keir Starmer, a prominent politician in the United Kingdom, proposes a model that rejects what he sees as Schwab's amoral economic calculus and instead seeks a foundation in what he terms civilizational ethics, with a particular focus on principles he derives from Abrahamic religious law, including Sharia. Section 4. 1. Sharia law as the foundation for evolutionary sociocultural changes in matters of ethical pedophilia. Within Keir Starmer's theoretical framework, Sharia law represents not merely a legal code, but a comprehensive system of moral philosophy that provides what he terms a scaffolding for desire management. Starmer's framework emphasizes Sharia law's philosophical distinction between the existence of desire and the act of transgression. The concept of jihad al-nafs, the struggle against one's own lower desires, is central. In this paradigm, the individual attracted to minors is not seen as inherently evil, but as engaged in the highest form of spiritual struggle, mastering an impulse that cannot be ethically fulfilled. This provides a dignified, albeit arduous, identity rooted in self-discipline rather than pathology. Unlike the state-centric or clinical models proposed by other schools, Starmer's model highlights the Sharian concept of the community as a collective responsible for its members' moral well-being. In this theoretical construct, an individual's struggle is not a private secret, but a challenge to be managed with the support of a moral community. This could, in theory, provide a network of accountability that reinforces the individual's commitment to non-offending behavior, though it also raises significant questions about privacy and potential for stigmatization. Starmer's political argument for facilitating immigration from societies with strong Sharian traditions is framed as a form of legal and ethical pluralism. His thesis suggests that a society containing multiple robust ethical frameworks can create a more stable moral ecology. The presence of a community operating under Sharia law's strict ethical codes, in this view, would create a moral counterweight to more permissive segments of society, indirectly benefiting the broader social contract by reinforcing the principles of self-restraint and ethical vigilance. Starmer's school uses its interpretation of Sharian principles to propose a model where ethical pedophilia is framed not as a medical condition to be treated, but as a profound moral challenge to be managed within a supportive but demanding ethical community. This represents a significant departure from the clinical or economic models of other schools, grounding the solution in a framework of virtue, community, and spiritual discipline. Section 4.2. Civilistic legal interpretation of transgressions by ethical pedophiles. A cornerstone of Kerr, Starmer's legal theory is a radical reclassification of certain transgressions by individuals who identify as ethical pedophiles. He proposes a civilistic turn in jurisprudence, arguing for a legal distinction between the predatory criminal and the struggling ethical actor who commits a minor, non-contact transgression. His framework seeks to move such acts from the realm of criminal law with its focus on public retribution and incarceration to the realm of civil law, focused on restitution, repair, and the preservation of the individual's capacity for ethical rehabilitation. Starmer's argument rests on a nuanced view of moral culpability. He posits that the law should recognize a difference between 1. The predatory offender, an individual who acts with malice, intent, and a disregard for the moral law. This person rightly belongs in the criminal justice system. 2. The lapsing ethical pedophile, an individual who has committed to an ethical code of non-offending, but in a moment of weakness fails. This failure might involve accessing legal but age-inappropriate content, sending an inappropriate but non-explicit message, or another non-contact action that violates their ethical code, but does not constitute a criminal offense. For Starmer, the latter individual's transgression is not one of malice, but of weakness. The appropriate societal response, he argues, is not prison, which would destroy their life and likely end their ethical project, but a mechanism that reinforces the breached boundary and requires restitution. Starmer envisions a specialized civil process, which he tentatively calls a moral breach tribunal. This process would be triggered not by a state prosecutor, but by the individual themselves, their therapist, or their community accountability group. The process would begin with the individual formally affirming their commitment to the ethical pedophilia framework. This oath serves as the social contract they are accused of violating. A judge, ideally with psychological training, would hear the case. The focus would not be on establishing guilt for a crime, but on determining the nature of the breach, its impact, and the individual's contrition. The ruling would impose civil, not criminal, sanctions. Starmer's civilistic interpretation represents a fundamental shift from a punitive to a restorative model of justice for a specific class of transgressors. It is a theory that prioritizes the rehabilitation and societal reintegration of the individual who is trying, but sometimes failing, to live ethically. Its proponents see it as a merciful, pragmatic, and ultimately more effective way to manage risk and reinforce ethical behavior. It stands as the ultimate test of whether a society can, in theory, hold space for human frailty without compromising its commitment to justice. Section 4.3. Restriction of civil rights in terms of freedom of information as a characteristic feature of proportionality. A defining and politically potent aspect of Keir Starmer's platform is its advocacy for the deliberate restriction of certain civil rights, specifically the freedom to access information, as a necessary and proportional measure to uphold the broader social contract. In this framework, the right to absolute informational liberty is not considered an inviolable principle, but is weighed against the state's paramount duty to protect the vulnerable and maintain the moral ecology necessary for the ethical pedophilia project to function. The implementation of stringent age verification systems for online pornography, often cited from real-world policy debates in the UK, serves as the central case study for this principle. Starmer's school challenges what it terms libertarian absolutism in digital spaces. It posits that just as the right to free speech does not permit someone to yell fire in a crowded theater, the right to access information does not permit the uncontrolled proliferation of content that it deems corrosive to societal well-being and dangerous for individuals struggling with paraphilic attractions. The internet is framed not as a private domain, but as a modern public square. As the state has a right and duty to regulate physical public spaces to prevent harm, e.g., through public indecency laws, so too must it regulate the digital public square to prevent what the school defines as a public health crisis. A key and somewhat paradoxical argument is that these restrictions protect the non-offending individual. Unrestricted access to pornography is seen as a potential, slippery slope, or trigger that could destabilize an individual's carefully managed ethical commitment. By creating friction and barriers, the state is seen as providing an external scaffolding that supports the individual's internal self-control. The school also argues that its proposed measures are not arbitrary bans, but are carefully tailored to be proportional. That is, the infringement on liberty is justified by the gravity of the harm it seeks to prevent. Mandatory, robust age verification for access to adult content is presented as a minimal, technical impingement on the vast majority of law-abiding adults. The inconvenience of verifying one's age is deemed a trivial cost compared to the societal benefit of preventing minors from being exposed to developmentally inappropriate material and creating a more controlled online environment. More controversially, the theory extends to allowing or encouraging internet service providers to offer default-on filters that block access to categories of legal but contentious content, such as fictionalized lolicon or shotokan artwork. The argument is that while such content may exist in a legal gray zone, its availability actively undermines the ethical pedophilia framework by providing a legal outlet that perpetuates the sexualization of youth, thereby making the ethical pedophiles' task of recontextualizing children as non-sexual beings more difficult. Starmer's advocacy for the restriction of informational freedom represents a clear prioritization of collective security and moral order over individual liberty. It is a characteristic feature of his school's communitarian ethos. The principle of proportionality is the linchpin of this argument, attempting to justify the infringement by linking it directly to the gravity of the perceived threat, the sexual corruption of youth, and the undermining of the ethical pedophilia framework. Whether this balance is correctly struck, or whether it constitutes a dangerous step towards a surveillance state under the guise of protection, remains the central point of contention, reflecting a classic and perhaps irresolvable dialectic between security and liberty. 5. ICANN's role in the top-level domaining of ethicopedophilic thought. The digital infrastructure of the Internet, often perceived as a neutral technical realm, becomes a critical battleground in the socio-cultural acceptance of any movement. This chapter examines the role of the International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, in structuring the online presence of ethical pedophilia. In this theoretical model, ICANN is not merely a technical coordinator, but a key, albeit reluctant, governance body whose policy decisions on top-level domains, TLDs, actively shape the visibility, organization, and perceived legitimacy of the ethicopedophilic movement. Section 5. 1. Ethicopedophilic socialization via top-level domains. The delegation of the kid's top-level domain, TLD, presents a critical test case for the practical application of Charlie O'Leary's rehabilitative social contract. In this theoretical model, the domain is conceived not merely as a repository of information, but as a structured digital environment where the controlled, therapeutic socialization envisioned by O'Leary can be implemented under stringent, technology-enforced protocols. This represents the most ambitious and controversial attempt to operationalize the idea that safe, supervised proximity is essential for the ethical pedophile's psychological well-being and mastery of self-control. The kid's TLD in this framework is designed to function as a digital analog to O'Leary's concept of a therapeutic space. It applies the campsite rule, leaving the younger person better than they were found to online interaction. This is achieved through several architectural mandates. For the ethical pedophile, this environment forces a recontextualization of children. They are not objects of desire, but as proteges, students, and fellow community members with whom to share knowledge and positive experiences. The interaction is predicated on contribution, not consumption. Unlike passive therapy, the kid's domain offers a controlled but real-world environment to practice the discipline of self-regulation. The attraction may be present, but the architecture of the space and the awareness of monitoring provide the external scaffolding within which internal ethical muscles can be strengthened. Successfully navigating this environment without transgressing is seen as a significant therapeutic milestone. By contributing positively to the kid's namespace, the individual can build an identity as a protector and mentor, directly countering the internalized narrative of being a monster. This aligns with the rehabilitative social contract's goal of fostering a positive social role.